Well, hello, everybody. My name is Jake Milstein, and welcome to our urgent panel discussion today about the MOVEit vulnerability and the CLOP ransomware. I don't know how close attention people have paid, but there have been new developments just this morning on this, and we'll get to those in a minute. Um, there are two different kinds of panel discussions we have. Some sort of your standard, talking about the new NIST or talking about budgeting or talking about regular security, and then the urgent panels. And, one of the things that we care deeply about as an organization, we're mission focused on making sure that, critical infrastructure is defended against cyber attack. And part of that is arming you all with knowledge and having these open forums. So to that end, if you haven't been to these before, on the right hand side, you can see there's a chat. Ask questions, talk amongst yourselves. I love interrupting the panelists and asking questions that come up in the chat. So don't be shy, and we'll get started here. Um, so, you know, obviously there's that chat. Let us know where you're joining from. Um, always good to have folks here. On the top of the chat, well, housekeeping here, there's a little bell if it doesn't have an X through it, then you're hearing ding, ding, ding. If you hit it, you can mute the chat and you won't hear ding, ding, ding. Everybody who registered for this will get a recording of this from the system. Because systems don't always work, and it's a marketing system, so it's not the most perfect system in the world, now is it? We are going to put a video of this on our YouTube channel. So if you want to share a video of this or anything, you'll see it on our YouTube channel. We'll also email it out. We'll also email out the slide deck. So if folks want that, we will send it out. If you don't know us, Critical Insight defends critical infrastructure. We help organizations prepare for attacks, detect them quickly, and respond decisively with Security Operations Center and a bevy of experts internally. Three of those experts are joining me today. Mike Hamilton and Fred Langston founded the company. Mike is our CISO, and he's the former CISO of the city of Seattle. Fred is our chief product officer, and he has run our consulting organization. And John-Luc Peck is joining us as well. He is deputy CISO of the company, and he's our director of incident response. So, as folks deal with ransomware situations or breaches, and you call our 800 number 24/7, which is not how we want to meet anybody. John-Luc's the guy who responds. Again, my name is Jake Milstein. I'm the least interesting part of this whole thing, but I am the event host, so you do have to listen to me. And I apologize for that ahead of time. So, Mike, will you get people up to speed here on what's going on?
Sure. So, if you subscribe to the daily IT security news blast, that all the articles have been about this. This has been going on now for a couple of weeks, and when it was first announced, there was a payment processor in the UK that first got hit, and because they were a payment processor for a lot of larger organizations, those larger organizations started to get hit, and so that ended up being British Airways and the British Broadcasting Corporation. At first, it looked like it was kind of concentrated in the UK. Now it's everywhere. And I don't think it is incorrect to say that there are at least hundreds of victims here. And so here's a few of the headlines coming out. We can't even enumerate all the victims. I do know that the states of Louisiana and Oregon both had their DMVs pillaged for all the driver's license records. So that's not good. That we're going to end up with a whole bunch of records being exposed publicly if the extortion demands don't get paid, and that's going to hurt people. I don't know if they're going to monetize these records, because I think that's fallen a little bit out of favor, and what they're doing is probably just holding the records back so that if you're not going to pay the extortion demand to get your network back, they make the records public. And some of that has started to happen already. U.S. federal agencies, and we don't have a complete list. I know the USDA is one of them. I think they're holding that information a little tightly right now. Banks and universities, obviously. And so ultimately, there's going to be millions of people whose records have been purloined different kinds of records, some of them more valuable than others. And we don't really know the extent to this yet. There could have been intellectual property stolen and, other kinds of things that an organization would want to get back and might be incentivized to pay to get back. As this continues to develop, we'll find out more about the content of the records, because for sure some are going to be made public. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Jake.
No, I mean this is a really shocking slide, and one of the reasons why where we're doing the urgent panel is the victims, and I'll just key it, the last one, several federal agencies, I mean that just seems like the beginning of it, Mike. I mean this is big.
The body count is going up by the minute. I think Fred checked in very recently and just saw that they're still being added. There are other organizations that are reporting we're having a cyber problem and nothing more. And so, we suspect that this may be the cause of that. But you can see this list of victims. It doesn't matter what sector you're in. It doesn't matter how valuable your records are. This is really a crime of opportunity is the way it looks, right? A vulnerability was announced, a ransomware gang. On the surface, the way it looks is they weaponized very quickly an exploit, located all of the exposures of this particular piece of software, this MOVEit file transfer software, and then started taking everybody over. That's the story for publication. But when we get a little later into our discussion here, I have questions about that, and some stuff just doesn't check out for me. And, we're going to speculate. But at this point, it's so early in this. It's really, it was the end of last week. We said, we've got to say something about this. It's going to be going on for a while. We have a lot more to find out. But I think it's interesting that some of the organizations that were hit were auditors organizations. Ernst & Young and PwC, those are auditors. They have a lot of secrets for the corporations that they work for, not the least of which are their security controls. Right? And their compliance controls and things like that. We bring in auditors to audit us, and I would really hate for their raw data that they collect to be purloined by some criminal organization to use against us. The government of Nova Scotia, there have not been and I think somebody from Nova Scotia is on here, there have not been very many attacks against political organizations that large, apart from a couple in was it Puerto Rico? I think it was Puerto Rico. The entire country was hit, and just infrastructure wasn't working all over the place. I don't know how bad it is in Nova Scotia right now, but this is another one where they got what looks like an entire government. Johns Hopkins University is one of the ones that's saying, well, we're having some kind of cyber problem. And nothing more. So, again, as more information emerges, we're gonna be able to put some better fencing around this to understand what the magnitude of the victim list looks like. But right now, like I said, the body count's piling up by the minute.
Yeah, and one quick thing. I know somebody will correct us. Puerto Rico's territory, not a country. Fred, when you see some, you've been doing this for decades and decades. When you see a list like this, I mean, this is one of the widest spread attacks we've seen in a long time.
Yeah, this is probably the most well coordinated, most well planned campaign I've seen in a long time. It's a combination of multiple gangs actually pulling their resources, probably at the behest of the Russian government. This one. There are so many things about this that are going to be studied for a long time because of the way this is done, the residence time, and they probably had this vulnerability for over a year. They've been using it for over a year to do this. And interestingly, they did not use ransomware as the final step, or at least so far they haven't. So a whole bunch of interesting things. I think it's ironic that Norton LifeLock got popped. I'm not sure who they're going to call to restore their identity.
And look at the thing on the bottom there. So this is weeks old. A few weeks ago, the U.S. government said, hey, if you know anything about this CLOP ransomware gang and you can help us identify and apprehend these folks, we have $10 million for you. Yeah. So the federal government's been real serious about these guys for a while, and as when you look at the magnitude of the victim list here, I mean, you have to start asking yourself questions like, how many people are in this gang? Is this an organization of 1,000 people? Because scaling that broadly, that quickly, it requires resources.
Yeah, and Rebecca in the chat says, the Oregon DMV didn't even make your list, and 3.5
That's
million
right.
records exposed. I think, I will say, if I let Mike use whatever font he wanted on our slides, he would have fit them all in, but I don't allow him to do that. So let's talk about the CVE, Mike and Fred.
All right. Well,
Go
I'll
ahead,
jump
Fred.
in and talk about it. You bet. So what we're seeing here is essentially a SQL injection vulnerability. The one that they're taking advantage of was the very first one that was published. This particular vulnerability means that they can inject basically query statements into a SQL database and dump the records back out. So what they were using was this ability to go in and run arbitrary commands once they've figured out how to run the SQL injection to get the database to cough up any information that was available in the database. So they also, once they own these particular systems, then they also are going to support other types of activities as a launching point to attack other systems within these systems. We know that they've been working on this for well over a month, putting these components in place for this final part of the attack. The people that are being pointed at, we call it CLOP. It could be C10P0P, CL0P. It's just know that it's a compendium of a bunch of different Russian cyber gangs. Fin11 is one of them. TA22 is yet another designation that they're used, but it's really probably Revil. If you remember us talking, I think a year and a half ago, we had another emergency seminar, and it was about Kaseya and how Revil had done the same exact thing. Now, what was Kaseya? Well, it's a file transfer program. What is MOVEit? It's a file transfer program. There's clearly a motif popping up here that Revil really likes going after these file transfer things. Why? Because it's a small market, and the penetration is about 10 to 15 companies that are really strong in this. And if everybody is using one of those 10 to 15 products, that's a heck of a great attack surface to go after, right? That's why they're going after these types of applications, because they're used ubiquitously. They're at all sorts of companies, big and small. And once you're inside them, you can use them as a great launching point to not only use the data on the file transfer system, but to use it to launch other attacks.
Yeah, and some questions coming in the chat here, Fred. Does the database actually store the contents of the file? Is the SQL injection performed on the login prompt of MOVEit? How is it done?
And hard to say exactly because I haven't exactly run
that seems right. That
Yeah.
seems right? Because what you're being presented with is a login page, and a SQL injection is when you are allowed to put unbounded structured query language commands directly into the form fields rather than your username, for example. So that sounds right to me. Can't confirm, but that sounds like the way it would work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
from the CVE, they're saying very specifically, it would allow an unauthenticated attacker to gain access to the MOVEit transfers database. So this sounds very much like you look at the web login prompt, you throw the SQL injection attack, boom, you have access to the content inside the system.
And this is a 1A mistake. This is absolutely a 1A mistake. Server-side input validation is something that people have known to bake into their web applications since the OWASP organization was founded.
Yeah.
And there were two more vulnerabilities, Fred.
Yeah, the two other vulnerabilities that came out, both of them should be treated with the same level of urgency to patch them up. The one that came out last Thursday is a 0-day again. It's about more problems with the managed file transfer service. And then there was one that was released yesterday, is yet another SQL injection flaw. It sounds like this one might have been used because it's used to escalate privileges, meaning out the other side of running this particular SQL injection command, I'm going to end up with maybe admin credentials or admin level access to systems, and then I can pivot off the system and do other bad things to other systems. So while we know that they're only attacking the first one, we should assume that these other two, which have been discovered by Progress themselves, these were not reported. The first one was a reported vulnerability. These two are not. These are ones Progress software themselves found, but that does not mean the bad guys have not already figured these out. In fact, I would expect the same bad guys that found the initial SQL injection attacks are probably all over these and ready to take advantage of these as well. The one thing that we want to point out, and I'll point it out here and we'll point it out later, treating any instance where there is a 0-day exploit on a system that is exposed to the internet or a large population of attackers should always be treated as an incident. It is no longer a patching exercise. When you have a 0-day vulnerability exposed to the world, it is an actual incident. It hasn't happened yet, but it will within hours. So you need to treat it like an incident. If other companies, all of these companies, had treated this with the same severity level and response, they would have probably gotten ahead of this, because a lot of these attackers, this was published, a lot of these victims, after this was published, did not patch fast enough and got caught, right? So there's a race. I keep trying to get this across to people. The bad guys know how fast we patch now. So they are going to work to do all the bad things they're going to do before that window closes. So you have to treat it like an incident and get out there and patch these as fast as you possibly can. It's no longer okay to put it out to the next patch cycle or the next 30-day window. You have days. You've got days now to patch these things. Everybody has to get this, get this paradigm change in their thought process that no longer is it part of a patching cycle. It's an emergency.
And
Yeah,
you know,
and don't think that they're not going to find you either, because it's super easy to go to Shodan and find whatever exposures you're looking for. You know, if you've weaponized an exploit for a vulnerability that's been announced, it's super easy to find your victim list.
Yeah, they did a quick global search. There's still 2,500 hosts out there that are still have this vulnerability accessible right now as we're speaking.
and
So,
you know, and Jean-Luc, I see in the chat you're clarifying, you know, the file transfer breaches before and this one. You know, one, can you talk about that a little bit? And also, you know, why do you think that, you know, it's the file transfer programs that keep getting hit here?
That's a deep question, which I'm very glad that you want to talk about. So yeah, Fred mentioned Kaseya. There was also the Excellion breach from around that time. There was a period of about 6 months or a year or so where we had SolarWinds, Hafnium, Log4j, Kaseya, and Excellion, and these were all very concentrated, all very targeted supply chain based attacks. You know, with Kaseya and SolarWinds, I think they managed to get the malware injected into the software update supply stream. With Excellion, it was almost identical to this. There was a vulnerability in the file transfer platform. It allowed anybody who could access the web interface to throw this vulnerability and exploit at the device, and then boom, it's just going to give all of its secrets up, all of the content it was holding back in the what should have been the guarded, gated area here. And why these attacks are so popular, I think, comes down to the way that these organizations are using these transfer applications. And a lot of it, unfortunately, points right back to data hygiene. For example, we're talking about the state of Louisiana and the state of Oregon, and potentially 90% of driver's license holders from each state who have now had their records compromised. That, to me personally, is an insane number of records to be keeping on a transfer platform. Again, these are not working databases where there should be transactions going in and out and records being kept updated as the source of truth. These are not the driver's license database applications. These applications like MOVEit and like Excellion are intended for making a file or a set of files available to be transferred, and then they're intended to come down. Think of them as a self-hosted version of box.com or Dropbox or ShareFile or something. It's just instead of using Dropbox.com, you're using myhost.mycompany.com. which then unfortunately also means that the organization itself is responsible for managing and patching and maintaining it. And so when you have these agencies who are getting this file transfer application and then they're using it in normal course of business, but they're not going back and cleaning up behind themselves. They're not using policies which say files that are older than 30 days or 90 days are automatically shredded. We're limiting access here. We're restricting access inbound from the internet. It's one thing if you have a file transfer platform and you use firewall rules to say only these trusted groups or organizations are allowed to access this transfer platform. But if you've got it open to the general internet, and if you're a state agency or a federal agency and you need to make this platform or service available to the public, you can't just whitelist or allow list all IPs in the United States and then block the
Right.
rest of the world. Those numbers change too regularly. There's too many people around the world who would need to get access to the data. So it's definitely a predicament. But that's again where the data hygiene practices come into play. And so that way, if there is a vulnerability or an exploit along these lines again, you don't have 90% of residents or 90% of your records getting popped and breached because they're all sitting in essentially this glorified file transfer server because nobody went back and cleaned up behind themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, Fred and Mike, one of the things we've seen is some of the folks, folks might not even know that they have a service provider using this transfer service, MOVEit, to do this, right? I mean, it might be that you don't even know that it is moving your files, right, Fred?
I would say the bulk of the people you're going to see getting breached were actually people whose data was breached on a service provider implementation of MOVEit, right? I've seen that on a number of these, that it's not actually the entity that gets listed. It's they were breached because a service provider was using that tool that then lost their records as part of a service they're providing. So there's the whole concept of supply chain. There's supply chain in the software, right? The software supply chain had a bug in it that was taken advantage of. There's also the supply chain of who's using these tools and whose data is on them, because a lot of times it's a managed instance and it's 100 of customers' data is being flowing through this. That's what you would see at something like PwC, right? It's all of their customers are loading their data into this one system. That's why it's such a fantastic place to attack.
I'm not sure that those are the only records that are being stolen is from the file transfer application itself. The way I read this, it's being used as the entry point into organizations where they're then going in and stealing records internally, right? Not having nothing to do with what files got transferred, and those have gone out.
Yeah, that's also part of what
both those things are happening.
Yeah, I think both those things are happening. Correct.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next slide. But I mean, I do want to say, based on what Fred and Mike are saying, everybody should be asking their service providers, if you have an MSP, an MSSP, a consulting organization working with you, if they're using it, right? So,
yes.
All right. So, we talked a little bit about this, about CLOP, or is it CLOP or Fin11? Mike, what is the background of this group here?
Well, so Fred made a good point, right? I mean, these things are very amorphous and they move around and people move from one to the other. And it's like calling it a gang, I don't think is really factually, correct. It's extremely spongy in terms of the membership. And Fred brought up R-Evil, whatever, I don't even remember what we call that, who seems to have left the limelight a little bit. Well, that doesn't mean they've gone away. All right. So this particular gang, CLOP, Fin11, UNC, blah, 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 whatever it is. Okay. They like to use 0-day vulnerabilities, and they got very early into this double extortion business. Double extortion is, I'm going to snarl your network with ransomware, and here's your extortion demand. And by the way, if you don't pay us, we have all these records that we've stolen, and we'll give you a look at these, right? So that we're not lying to you. We have these records, and if you don't want them to be made public, then you're going to need to pay us, right? So it's double extortion. They have that hook in there. If the insurance company comes in and says, well, it's going to be cheaper for us to rebuild the network from scratch than it is to pay that ransom demand. All right, well, now they've got this extra piece of leverage, and so this is what this gang is known to do. This is fairly ubiquitous now. They're all doing this. And part of the reason for doing that is because records, if you steal records and use those for extortion, you're a criminal. If you use ransomware against critical infrastructure like a hospital, you're a terrorist. And so that's when this double extortion thing started to show up, and basically just extorting just based on records and not even using ransomware. Now, Fred said they have been in there longer than we think they've been in there. And the reports are that they have been working on this since 2021, that the probing for this, right, there's records of, all of the network scanning that was going on looking for this particular application from a way back, 2021. So that begs the question a little bit, is what we are being told about the timeline of events here actually accurate, right? Did this happen right after the vulnerability was announced, and then they hurriedly put together an exploit and located all the victim organizations and pulled the trigger and got into them all and exfiltrated their records? And doesn't make sense. Does not make sense. It makes more sense if you think that, as has been reported, they've been working on this for a long time, and finally they had to tip their hand. Excellion was brought up as another tool that this gang exploited, and Fortra very recently had a Go Anywhere file transfer program that was also whacked, and a whole bunch of hospitals' records were stolen as a result of that one. And so now there are class action suits happening everywhere against these organizations. And also, to Fred's point, and I think to John Luke's when he was talking about where all this is going, we can expect that litigation shoe to drop probably pretty soon now, because if you're the third party and you are kind of obliquely responsible for a whole bunch of this cyber carnage going on in today's world, the Federal Trade Commission comes in, the SEC goes sniffing around. There are lots of regulators that want to fine you and put you under the equivalent of a consent decree. And so all that stuff is still to happen. I want to say something about this thing on the right here. So, we monitor lots of weirdo stuff going on, and a lot of it is just bluster. But this thing came out recently, and it had to do with a recent event a couple of weeks ago where apparently our volunteers and Ukrainian volunteers did a denial of service attack against Russian banks, and it was successful, and it shut down a whole bunch of banking operations for a while. And they said, all right, we're coming back at you. I don't know if this is part of that. This seems to be more not something that's so retaliatory. It looks like something was planned over a long time. So that's probably not connected. But these threats to we're going to go after your banking system and the SWIFT system are starting to show up more. And all of these activists, volunteers, whatever you want to call them, who are patriotic on one side of the geopolitical conflict that's going on right now, are starting to show up with some regularity.
I want to point out a quick thing about the Revil or Our Evil gang. If you remember, almost a year ago, the U.S. government had shut down all of their servers and taken them over, and everybody said, oh, good, Revil's dead, Revil's gone. It actually affected us in a weird way in that all the encryption keys that people had paid for from Revil stopped working because the government took down their systems. We ended up having to pick up the pieces after that, where people had bought a ransomware key that no longer worked because the government took down the server that enabled that key to work. But the interesting thing is all the talk about, oh, we've destroyed Revil, Revil's taken out, the government's got him. Revil went nowhere. Revil was always there. They're just reconstituted. This is probably them stepping back from the activity they had, spent a year on a really complex campaign to get back on their feet and get to the top of the pile again.
Hey, there's Fred, speaking of Our Evil and CLOP and all of these folks, there's a really interesting side conversation going on in the chat about, why would anyone trust a criminal? Why would you pay a ransom to somebody who, has extorted your data? Because you could pay them and they could still release your data because they could just get double paid on it, right? And I was going to tell that same story you did, but how it's never easy to decide whether to pay the ransom, but like, is there honor among thieves?
Well, the first thing I'll say, there's a bunch of surveys that have been done asking people, would you pay a ransom? 80% of people responded, no, they would not. Well, they then further polled those 80% people, 80% a year later. And out of the ones that had an actual attack, 80% of those actually paid the ransom. So they said they wouldn't. Faced with the actual reality, they absolutely did pay the ransom. So we're not even trustworthy with what we say to the world on what we're going to do and what we end up finally doing. Why would you trust a bad guy? You should never trust a bad guy. You're just trying to manage the risk of the situation. It's all about risk management. There's no trust involved. Their reputations aren't worth anything. And in fact, it's quite likely that they're selling this data on another black market. They're just not releasing it to the dark web where everybody can auction it. They're just going to go to another cyber gang in Russia. They're going to have them pay for that stuff. And eventually that stuff will get compromised and used as well. So my personal opinion is if the data is monetizable, somebody somewhere will monetize that data, even if you paid to not have that data released. So I say no honor among thieves. It's just about trying to manage your risk when you're dealing with them.
And
Amen.
and John-Luc, I know you end up in a lot of conversations with folks who call our 800 number. They've had an incident. What do you think about, do you pay? Do you not pay? Extorted data. This is different. The system's not locked up here. Thoughts?
I think Fred's 100% right here. In this kind of a circumstance where, like the system is not encrypted, operations have not been brought to a grinding halt. They're demanding money so that they don't release data on the promise of you give us your money and we'll not release this stuff that we stole. And there is zero assurance. This is not a contractual, legally binding obligation here. This is not something where you're going to be able to go back and sue for damages because they didn't uphold their end of the bargain. And I think Fred is absolutely right that if there's a way for them to extract some kind of value out of that stolen data, they absolutely will, including just shuffling it over to another group or using a dark web forum or something underground. And so, yeah, I don't believe for a moment that if anybody were to pay the $100,000 to $100 million or whatever they're looking for in ransom demands across these victim organizations here, that they would not release them. This does touch on to a really interesting question, which, like we noted in the chat, is kind of the perpetual question for victim organizations of ransomware, and that is whether to pay the terrorists and the kidnap and ransom gangs who are holding your network and data hostage. For me, the advice that I give to clients and organizations who are either experiencing an incident at the moment or conducting preparedness work where we're going through tabletop exercises about you've just been ransomware, how do we handle this here? The only circumstances in which I would recommend even thinking about paying the ransom are if you are a critical service organization like a hospital, like a fire department, or there are things that your systems do which affects life safety. If you're a municipal and your water system has been ransomwared, and if you don't get it back online, nobody's going to have running water in their households. That's a circumstance I would think about it in. The average business who's just got some business disruption going on or data may be at risk, no, I wouldn't even think about it. We have seen way too many times when an organization gets compromised by ransomware, the ransomware gets eradicated in one form or another, it comes right back. If there's any vulnerabilities left, if there's any possibility of a remote beacon being implanted in the network, the attackers will go away for a little while and then come right back 3, 6, 9 months later or so, and you are right back where you started there. And so there are some organizations who are faced with the prospect of needing to pay this extortion fee one or more times for pretty much the same crime. Uh, I do believe that there is some honor among thieves, and that they do have code that they work and live by, sort of the pirates code. And we heard from some of the ransomware gangs a year and 2 years ago. I think mainly when they were starting to be targeted by some of the various apparatuses of the U.S. government here, they started saying, "Oh no, we're not going to go after critical infrastructure. That's not us. If you're a hospital, if you're a charity organization, you don't have to pay the ransom. It's fine. We'll tell you how to unlock it." Well, yeah, sure. When you've got the FBI, the Department of Justice, and various military military elements who are all staring right at you, trying to figure out what's the best way that I can shut you down here. Yeah, they're going to come out and say, "Oh, we're upholding, these values. We are honorable, decent criminals out here." I don't believe it for a minute. I personally, again, absolutely advise organizations, if you pay the ransom, you are funding terrorism. I think the government is looking at that the right way. You're going to be on the wrong side of law enforcement and the federal government, even if you provide the notification that OFAC is looking for to give you the get out of jail free card. There's still absolutely no guarantee they're going to live up to the attacker's end of the bargain, or that they're not going to come back in 3, 6, 9 months or so.
I'll also say, the criminals are counting on one of the standard, con man things, which is people who are conned don't ever like to admit that they were conned, right? So if you pay the ransom and they still release the data, nobody wants to admit, yeah, I did that and it didn't work out. I think that also, that also plays into it.
Yeah. Two quick points to make here. One, just to support what Fred said, they grab your data. They go, look, we're not going to do anything. You pay us, and we're just going to delete all of this stuff. That stuff can show up a lot later, after everybody has quit looking for it. But the thing is, and this is well known now, the dark web forums, so many of them have been shut down. They're going to underground Telegram channels to trade all this stuff, so we don't see it anymore. So when you may have received, that assurance, you're going to get your data back or we're going to delete it, there is no reason to believe that. The second point I'll make is when the response is going on and the question is, we going to pay this, we going to not pay this, it's not your choice to make. That is your insurance company's choice to make. And that's who's going to make that choice. And so, they're trying to get out as cheaply as possible. And unfortunately, in a capitalist society, that's who gets to make that choice.
So,
point out
go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, the CLOP gang on Friday released a public statement. They have a PR firm or public statement, and they said, if you're a government, if you're a school, if you're a hospital, no worries. We're not going to expose your data. We're good people, and we're not going to do that. I paraphrased a little bit. It was pretty close to that exact statement, to which all of us go, sure. It's just a way of managing an image. It is not an actual policy statement by a bunch of crooks.
All right, let's talk about remediation here, Fred.
Sure. So I said treat as an incident. I cannot stress this enough. The bad guys know what we do. They read our best practices. They know what they are, and they're going to just go around them, right? They know we patch in 30 days. You got to patch sooner than that. So apply the patches everywhere. Test and validate that the patch actually took. Run a little test. Potentially even run the exploit, because you can actually get the exploit, and test and see if that vulnerability is actually not there when you've done patching it. Again, until you apply the patch, excuse me, disable HTTP and HTTPS access to that application. So until you're able to patch, first thing you go do, turn off HTTP and HTTP access to that application. Go take a look and find out if this particular IP address, which is where the command and control site was loading up more malware to be dropped for a secondary payload. In other words, this is how they start expanding influence, attacking other systems. Make sure, go look at your threat hunting and see that this particular IP and this particular port 22, have not had any activity on them. If they have, then you're literally seeing indicators of the attack happening.
That's actually a 22-bit mask.
Yeah. Search for large outbound file transfers. This one is trickier than it seems. Data exfiltration by looking at data volumes is more art than science. In fact, the most common method to detect data exfiltration is you're looking for the tools used to exfiltrate data. Unfortunately, this application is the tool that exfiltrated the data, so you don't get that luxury of having a tool to look for like rclone or something like that. And search for web shells with file names that look like something else, right? So take these particular executables or ASPX library and run it through VirusTotal, right? If you see things in there that potentially could have been altered as part of this, check them. All you have to do is dump them into VirusTotal. It'll tell you if it's good or bad. That's a great way to figure out if these particular components of your system have been compromised.
And, a question that's come up a couple of times in the chat is, does it matter if I'm using the web interface or if I'm using the downloaded software of MOVEit? Fred, you can test it this way, right?
Yeah, you could definitely test it. Here's what I would suggest, though. The downloaded version is just sending the same information up to an API. So you would expect that API to have the same coding as the web application itself. Therefore, we'd expect, not positive, but expect to have the same vulnerability.
Yeah. And, John Luke, I know you've been answering a bunch of questions in the chat about, how this all works. Can you bring some of that information from the chat into what we're saying here?
There's a lot of detail that we're going over here. Yeah. So first up, this is a server application. This is something which an organization would install on a virtual machine or on a server running on their network, which they then make available to the internet. That's why Fred's advice about cutting off outside access, disabling HTTP and HTTPS. Personally, I'd recommend just nuking all outside access to that application until you get it updated and patched and everything. That's critical right there, because until you get it patched, you are absolutely sitting at risk, and there's no telling what's going on while you're not looking. The other thing that I would look at and think about is preserving a copy of all your logs. If you can, save a copy of the system state. Keep as much information and records on hand for potential future forensic needs if it turns out that you did have a breach or some kind of illicit access there. The vulnerability itself, I personally, I'm not 100% sure that we do know that there was an RCE component to this. The write-ups and the CVEs that I'm seeing are talking just about SQL injection, which allowed for access to the content database. We've been talking
and privilege escalation too, right?
Well, that's the second vulnerability is they'll leave that. This is an interesting question because I've read some people talking about RCE capabilities, but I'm seeing a SQL injection attack, which does not to me say RCE. So there again, we're still figuring some of this stuff out in real time on how it's actually can be exploited.
Exactly. And so I think there's some X factors, there's some unknowns here as to whether, in the case of the state of Oregon and the state of Louisiana, did they truly have 90% of driver's license records sitting in the MOVEit transferred content database? Or was there an RCE component that maybe hasn't been publicized yet, and the attackers were able to move inside further to the network? And so that's where potential forensics are going to be critical. If you think there's even a chance, for example, if you know you're running this application on your services, your network, and if you think there's a chance that somebody used it to pivot further inside the network, that's where preserving all your logs is going to be absolutely critical. We're taking a look at the system state and understanding what was done on the MOVEit server. I almost said Excelion here. What was done on the MOVEit server, and then were they able to get further access inside the network? Putting a scope, putting boundaries around the extent of what may have been accessed by the outside attackers is going to be critical to determining the extent of the breach here. There are a lot of layers to this, but yeah, this is not a lightweight one. This is not a simple, just go and run your Windows update sometime next month, you'll be fine. This is absolutely take it down until you know it's fixed. Examine it with a fine tooth comb to figure out, did anybody get in? Did they get to records they weren't supposed to? And then make sure that it's patched and updated before you put it back online.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just threw something in the chat here that describes the web shell that they uploaded using the SQL injection vulnerability. Web shell means they have interactive access. Welcome to the network. Have a look around. That's what happened.
Exactly.
You're totally right about that. So there it is.
All right. Mike, I know you have looked at this with a bit of a side eye.
Yeah. And look, being able to scale this quickly and that broadly does not make sense unless, like I say, I mean, this is a 1,000-person organization, with very good management. So, the gang weaponized the vulnerability and exploited at scale in mere days. Really? Okay. They were able to steal records at scale, apparently not having that long to be in a network to look around to find the right records that are actually going to have value that you could use for an extortion demand. Really? All right. There's only one gang. I mean, we're saying CLOP, you know, Fin 11, CLOP, whatever. Really, Chinese government is not doing this at all. That is really unlikely. All right, the Russian government has no knowledge of this. There's already been a couple of pieces come out. I think I've got one on the next slide. Is American Hospital Association says this has got fingerprints of the Russian government on it. So, you know, I don't think again that this went down the way that we're being told it went down. There's more going on behind this, and I bet it comes out later. Go to the next slide, Jake. Okay, so here's Hamilton pontification and speculation. All right. So there's the American Hospital Association saying this group may be operating with the tacit or explicit approval of the Russian intelligence services. That makes sense. Because if they've been working on this since 2021, it is unlikely that the Russian government did not know, right? I mean, there is open collusion between the gangs and the government and the FSB and everybody else, right? So they've been in there for a long time. During that time, they had plenty of time to find the records that have value and pull them out. During that time when they were quiet in there, I think that the Russian government was using them for espionage, intellectual property theft, other things that were of strategic value to the government. And then once the vulnerability came out and made public, where all the other actors were going to swarm this, they had to raise their hand and say, we did it. We're in. We got it. We already got you all. But I think that's closer to what's actually happening here than what we are being told in the press. And again, speculation, but we're going to find out as time goes on.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I left questions here, but
And
you know,
Stefan is
we've been
making a good point.
talking through
Stefan is making a
what,
good point.
Which point? Oh, about this being on YouTube?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, lots of folks have posted lots of articles and lots of things. So, you know,
That's why I was getting login failures from all over the world every 20 seconds for 2 weeks, is because of this stuff.
You have 2FA. So, you know, I mean, you know, there are a bunch of questions here. Anthony's the latest one. So MOVEit is stating the data is encrypted at rest and in transit. So how are they able to see the contents of this data if it was so-called encrypted?
And again, I don't think the records in the MOVEit application are the records we're talking about here. Right?
Well,
When they
also,
say they dropped a web shell, that let them go in and out as they please and find the stuff they wanted. So it's not necessarily
if you're able to run a
database.
SQL, if you're able to run a SQL injection command, it's going to unencrypt that data just like any other query to the database, right? So you can get it
That's
out
true,
unencrypted, right? It's not like they stole the database; it's they use SQL injection to drain the database of all the records. And then there's the remote or that escalation with the webhook that takes all that out of scope, and then they're attacking every system on the internal network, ones that may or may not be encrypted.
You know, and when we think about, you know, when we think about the size of this, you know, and how this continues to grow, you know, is this going to be one of the biggest ones ever? Is this going to be one of the ones that we look back on and say, yeah, that was one of those seminal moments, Fred?
Yes, because of the nature, the broad nature of it. The monetary value is going to be right up there with NotPetya or, you know, some of those earlier events. This is definitely a watershed. And I think what I'm hoping, and Mike probably will provide his opinion on this, it will finally move the government to realize the government needs to step in and start putting their foot down and saying, we have to have certain levels and standards we're going to maintain. Maybe it's about patching. Maybe it's about you know, the ability to have one system, you know, serving tens of thousands of customers, that maybe it needs some level of certification. You must be this tall to ride the ride, where the government says, yeah, if you're going to serve, you know, 1 billion records, then we need to make sure that you're securing your stuff into some reasonable level.
And Mike, I mean, that's what the White House cybersecurity strategy was all about, right?
Well,
I mean, or what is it all about? Yeah.
Well, part of it is about the fact that the liability for these events cannot be borne by the victim. Part of the liability belongs with the manufacturer of the software, whoever's producing the flawed product. And so that's why, and this is part of the national cybersecurity strategy that may not reach its fruition because Congress would have to get involved to develop a liability framework for software manufacturers, right? When the government uses the power of the purse to say, if you can't prove your stuff is secure and there's no plan to keep it secure, we're not going to buy it. That is just a pure market force, and they can make that happen. When they want to regulate and they want to say, okay, if your piece of software ends up being the cause of all this carnage, we're going to hold you liable. You're getting into where, the gridlock we see in Congress is not going to let something like that happen. So there's a couple of answers to that question. I think that, frankly, when the dust settles around this and the new trend of a class action suit following in every time there is big records disclosure, that's going to be enough to, shake a few people loose. Is this going to be enough to really revisit national policy? We just came out with a cybersecurity strategy. I actually think so. If we don't develop standards of behavior, that if you're on our side, if our side of the demarc, right, that our logical border, and you don't maintain that standard of behavior, we just kick you out, including all your legit business. And they can go howl at the government and say, control the criminals because we can't do business in the United States. That's where we're going to have to eventually land on policy. Nobody is willing to pull that scab off.
Yeah, I mean, I think super important. Hey, as we get towards the end here, there are a couple of things I want to cover. Number one is, for every one of our webinars, we share a survey. We want to know, hey, was this useful? Was this helpful? And also, and my colleague Ginny is going to put it there in the chat. We don't use MOVEit. You can click the link. Fred, I know one of the things you and I talked about is what folks need to do. Obviously, these are the services we provide, but what do you think people should do here? And whether they work with us, whether they work with somebody else, you have some policy work to do. You got to be watching your network 24/7. Incident response retainers. What are things people should be thinking about?
So the thing it's what I said earlier, is that your patch management, your vulnerability management program, you really need to review those policies and your practices. If you are not treating these things as an incident, because it's an incipient incident, it will happen. Nothing's going to stop it from happening if that 0-day vulnerability is sitting on externally exposed. So that's an incident that's going to happen. If you don't treat it as such, you will always be behind the 8 ball, and then you're going to need all the rest of our service, which is incident response and getting a team out there to help you recover from ransomware, right? That's your two choices there. So this has become very stark, and this is a paradigm change to where IT managers are going to have to go in and say, yes, we have to take down that critical system over the weekend because it will be taken down by the bad guys if we don't do that. And you've got to get to the point where you're building that concept in the board of directors and your executives' minds that this is a new world we're in, and you need to treat it as such. So I think if there's any lesson to be learned here, that's the lesson everyone needs to learn.
And I think the other one, Jean-Luc, is the incident response retainer question is, when there are these large global events, all of the incident response firms get slammed. And if you don't have somebody on retainer, you end up in a situation where you can't get the help you need.
You're back of the line. Absolutely. Yeah. So we discovered that in the Hafnium and the SolarWinds and the Kaseya era when there was
Log4j.
Log4j. Yep. It all happened pretty much at once. Incident response service providers were slammed and maxed out. Companies were calling up, literally throwing money at these companies saying, charge me double. I just need to get into your queue. I need services now. And they were still being given weeks of lead time. We had some clients who called us up and said, so I think I've got Chinese hackers on my Exchange server right now. And my other forensic service provider is telling me that they're going to mail me a disk imaging kit. I'm going to mail it back to them, and they might be able to tell me if I've got a hacker inside of 2 to 3 weeks or so. Does that sound right to you? And I said, no, this does not sound right. Absolutely not. And we were able to assist them right away to help them confirm that they had an attack and increase the priority with their insurance carrier and their chosen representatives there. So incident response retainers are an organization's answer to this, both MDR service providers and IR service providers. But as a client, this is the direction that you want to go, because an incident response retainer set up and staged long in advance of an actual incident means that if you do have an event, you can just pick up the phone and you've got resources there right away available on contract. You don't need to go through potentially days worth of send me a quote. I need to take a look at the contract. I got to get the T's and C's reviewed by my legal team. Can we get this turned over into this? And hang on, I got to go get the approval from the CFO. We've had some clients who needed incident response services right away, but the actual onboarding process took 5 days, a week, 10 days or so. And meanwhile, we as a service provider are kind of stuck because we can't give recommendations and advice when we don't have a contract in place. There's a world of trouble and challenges that could incur. So it's important to get these contracts lined up and ready to go on a moment's notice, so that when the next major event like this, when the next Hafnium 2.0 or the next Excellion or Kaseya breach, this MOVEit, I think, is a prime example, comes around, you have resources that you can activate right away to help you figure out, do you even have an event? Is this something that affects you? And if so, what's the scope?
And look, I got to admit here, I sort of dance the line between like, hey, we're an organization that can help you, and we at the same time, don't want these to be sales webinars. That's not the point. The point is to help you out and give you information. That said, I have somebody here saying, hey, how do we get in touch? My colleague Jenny is going to put in a link. If you want to, talk to Mike or Fred or John Luke, you can click that link, say who you want to talk to, and my colleague Ellie will set you up with that. Also, if you don't get it every day, Mike sends out an email every day with all the security news. You can sign up for it on our website. We also do security awareness trainings every other week. You can send all your folks to it. I know that security awareness training would not help with this incident, but hey, it helps with other ones. And you can schedule time with us just by emailing us. I want to do final thoughts here. And Ginny, if you would post the survey link again so people can take the survey, and if they want a meeting, they can set a meeting with that other link. But let's do final thoughts, 1 minute each. John Luke, Fred, and then Mike.
This isn't going to stop. We're going to see this again in the future, and it is up to organizations to make sure that you're protecting your data by potentially not even putting it out there into these kinds of platforms, as well as keeping your services up and running, up to date, patched, ahead of the curve here. But it is a perpetual game of cat and mouse, and in this case, the mouse won.
Fred.
Yeah. What I would say is that there are about 500 other shoes that are still going to drop on this actual incident. This is just the beginning, folks. We're going to be dealing with this probably for the next 3 weeks. Could be much worse, but there's certainly going to be a ton of activity on cleaning up after this coming up.
Mike.
And because this is just the beginning, and because a lot of other shoes are going to drop and more information is going to come out, it's going to get litigious. So whether or not your organization has been directly affected by this, you may be obliquely affected by this, and you may want to put this on your attorney's radar. Just because when people start suing each other, you're either going to have to take an aggressive or a defensive position on this, one of the two, because so many orgs are caught up in it. That, and yes, get ready to take a punch, because the whole idea here is not to keep yourself 100% secure. It's to be able to get back up off the mat before the 10 count.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully next time we see you all, it is on a happier topic and not quite an emergency, as Rick says in the chat. This is a cyber war, and we're all in it. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day. Please take the survey, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.